welcome to Moneylife. We are back to discussing Jet Airways again. And why not? With 22,000 jobs at stake and no resolution, we need to discuss this over and over again. And there are several reasons why all of us are involved. Even if we are not losing jobs, this is an important airline. Aviation is badly affected. Airfares have gone up and it affects all of us. If money goes out from the banks, that's going to affect us as well. So what's happened this week to warrant a discussion? After 2 months of trying and pretending, banks have now finally thrown up their hands and moved the bankruptcy court, which means that the entire issue of Jet Airways' survival, or rather its demise, will be discussed by the National Company Law Tribunal, which hears bankruptcy cases. And all the efforts at finding a suitor, looking at a non-bankruptcy solution, or trying to avoid going to the bankruptcy court has failed. So bankers had spoken to the Hindujas. We have wild WhatsApp rumors, probably aimed at keeping stock prices up, which pretend that bankers have spoken to some other leading industrialists, and the share prices are going up and down even today because there's an expectation and hope that something will come out of it, because people think there's value in Jet Airways. But there is one sentence which is part of an interview of this newspaper called Live Mint, which really gives the game away. It's quite interesting. They quote an anonymous banker, wanted to stay off the record, who told them that one or two parties had indicated interest in Jet Airways and buying it, but only once it reaches the bankruptcy court. Isn't this significant? Which means that nobody was interested in off-market deals for various reasons. There are so many operational creditors, there are foreign creditors. Nobody is going to buy a lemon not knowing what the price is. And there is another aspect also, that why would you buy something without the stamp of a court when you can get it much cheaper through the bankruptcy process? Remember, only recently bankers, 75% of them, which is a majority, agreed to accept an offer from an asset reconstruction company offering just about 150 crore, which is 1% of the money owed by this telecom company called Aircel. So Aircel owed 20,000. Bankers are willing to settle for 1%. They're willing to write off 99%. If this can happen, only a foolish businessman, and businessmen aren't foolish, is going to go and do a direct deal with unlimited liabilities, possible court cases, and whatever, because bankers are just part of the creditors, and bankers are primarily responsible for bungling this whole Jet Airways affair. I know it sounds harsh, but there is reason to sound harsh. You remember the ad where Amitabh Bachchan distributes some chocolates and says, "Pappu pass ho gaya"? This whole Jet Airways thing reminds me of it, because there was an edit in the Economic Times, very sensible one, which said that airlines need to be treated differently. The edit also said, and I'm going to read out a little bit from that edit because that's what makes sense. It says that Jet Airways is a test case for how banks must deal with companies that employ plenty of capital, mostly debt, and have very few tangible assets. The airline business, they point out, again, which everybody knows, is highly capital intensive, risky, and especially when the share of equity of the total capital employed is very low. So it calls for non-standard lending is what this edit says. It also says that lenders should do sensible things again, like lessen the risk with provisions for conversion of debt into equity and take over the airline for sale when it is still a going concern, which means when all its other tangible assets like its employees, its airline slots and other things are still of value and have not been given away to people. So, and that they don't deteriorate in value. Very sensible, right? So the question then is, are bankers, huge giant public sector banks, private sector banks, do they not understand this? Of course they do. Look at the history of India. In the 1990s, when India opened up aviation to the private sector after having nationalized the only fantastic airline that we had, which was Air India. And it was fantastic because it was run by JRD Tata. It was one of the best airlines in the world. We took it over, nationalized it, made a mess of it. It's a big bloated burden on the exchequer today. And now we opened up the skies 25 years ago. It's not a short time. And what did we do? The entire industry as well as government worked hard to ensure that one person cannot come back into aviation from the private sector, which was the Tata Group. Why? They had deep pockets, they had reputation, they could run an airline, but we don't want the good people. Instead, we gave licenses to a poultry farmer, to another who had connections, rumored connections with Dawood Ibrahim and was, the gangster, and he was shot dead later. A failed industry house which has defaults across the board, but all of them qualified to run airlines. Did they run them well? Yeah, sure. When you're borrowing money from banks, you can offer great service for a while, then they went bust. This is the first lot. Even before the Kingfisher Airlines and Jet Airways, there were some names that we've even completely forgotten, like NEPC. Did you know it ran an airline? It even actually bought over, some of the defunct airlines. All of them went down the tube for the exact same reasons, that they did not know how to run viable operations, they spent lavishly, they weren't earning enough, and there were at least 10 failed airlines over 25 years for bankers to learn from, which means every 2.5 years they would have an episode which should have taught them some lessons. They learn anything? No. In fact, when they lost money to Kingfisher Airlines, they did a few sensible things, while they did something extraordinarily astounding, like further lending against the Kingfisher Airlines brand name, which had zero value. Okay, but they at least took a personal guarantee from Vijay Mallya before they extended these loans, and which is why Mr. Mallya, the flamboyant Mr. Mallya, sitting in London, booed and heckled, is being held accountable. They had some hold over him. While look at what happens with Jet. Couple of months ago, in April, when bankers went and announced a half-baked, ridiculous statement which they put out even to stock exchanges, they said they were converting a huge chunk of equity at 1 rupee and they were going to hold 51% of the shares. What they forgot to tell us, what they did not clarify even after we wrote to them, is that Naresh Goyal would have continued to hold 25% of the equity. Etihad, which had 25, would be down to 12.5, and Mr. Goyal had a backdoor entry. If he found another buyer to tie for them, he could come back. Again, for very obvious reasons, this was a ridiculous deal. It failed. No buyer was interested. Nobody wanted to touch it with a barge pole. So 2.5 months later, we are in front of the bankruptcy court. And what do we have? That didn't happen, which means as of today, Naresh Goyal continues to hold 51%. We are asking bankers to be sensible, learn lessons. And did they not know what was wrong with Jet Airways? How is it that issues with tax evasion, maybe FERA also, everything comes up only after the airline is defunct? These rumors, including the shady antecedents of the promoter, who really owns it, whether part of the money, including ticket sales, was going to private companies belonging to him, was all in the public domain. There's a book about it, right? But bankers studiously turned a blind eye. Now, we like to pretend that this is because political interference, phone calls from Delhi are pushing bankers to lend money. Yes, of course they are. Let's not pretend it's not the case. But it is not only about phone calls from Delhi. We know and we hear rumors about bankers, their families, their friends getting lavish holidays, being entertained, introduced to all kinds of, glamour people and socialites. They are enjoying the good life, which is laid out by the airlines until they go bust, which is why they fail over and over again. How many times should we allow someone to fail before they're rusticated? 10 failures of private airlines, no lessons learned, no banker held accountable. The only time some bankers have been arrested was when they did something as outrageous as lending against the brand name of Kingfisher Airlines. that is about the only case. Everything else is supposed to be a genuine business failure. Misjudgment. Really? Misjudgment after 10 failures? I mean, how many times will Pappu fail? Will he ever pass? Or should he be rusticated? This is the status of the way banks look at airlines. This is the way banks lend money. And how does that affect us? Because banks go defunct, they raise money from people like us through all kinds of customer charges. Even that is not good enough to make up all these big holes left by big industrialists. So the exchequer takes the taxpayers' money, what should go to us for education, health, other welfare, to stop children dying in hospitals. That money instead goes to recapitalize banks and again to keep paying off the debts of large industrialists. This has to stop. What's going to happen at the bankruptcy court? There's a good chance that absolutely no value will be derived from banks. They will lose the entire 8,000 crore plus that Jet Airways owes them, almost all of it. If they get something, it may be a pretense. There are a whole lot of operational creditors. There are employees who haven't got paid, 22,000 of them. That amount itself runs it to several hundred crores. And I think a humane bankruptcy court is going to look at all these issues in perspective. There is a chance that somebody will come in and just take away what remains of that airline and literally start from scratch again. In fact, that today is the only positive outcome that one can look forward to. But the question is, this should be the last time that bankers are allowed to fail in the manner in which they lend to private airlines. Maybe they need to relook at all the airlines that are still flying in the sky and say, are they doing enough to protect their interests? Are they doing enough to protect our interests? We need to start asking these questions about others today. And let's hope that Jet gets taken over. Doesn't matter whether banks get any money or not. We need more airlines in the sky. Thank you.